Taoiseach, we welcome the publication yesterday of the Personal Insolvency Bill, and we are gratified that it takes on board a lot of the suggestions we had made in the legislation that we had brought before the Oireachtas before the Christmas. And it shows that this Oireachtas can really work if everybody is given an opportunity to have an input into legislation. However, we are concerned in relation to your proposals that it leaves the involvement of the banks in relation to secured debt as an optional involvement. And our proposal was radically different in this regard. Now, I think it's fair to say that you yourself have pointed out many, many times in the last 4 years that leaving issues to the discretion of the banks is a bad idea, and that effectively what we're getting here is light touch legislation. And what I'd like to ask you is, since what you're actually doing at the moment in this legislation is really putting the code of practice into legislation, but you're not giving teeth to it. And could I ask you to reconsider this matter and to ask whether the government will be introducing amendments to the bill to give it teeth, particularly in relation to secured creditors, and in particular in relation to home loans? And what are your intentions to strengthen the bill? Now, as you know, Taoiseach, last week I asked you a question about the ITSB and the interest rates they're charging. And in many cases it effectively is twice the rate that, for example, AIB is charging, and that's having a huge effect on mortgage holders. And I was just wondering, has any progress been made in resolving what is a very straightforward issue? It's basically a state-owned bank. And similarly, it's been brought to my attention that the EBS, which is now owned by the AIB and is one of Minister Noonan's pillar banks, and I believe the idea here was to get a bit of convergence. I was wondering what steps the government are going to take to ensure that there's convergence in the interest rate being charged on home loans by the EBS towards the AIB rate.
Thank you.
And could I also just point out on the ITSB that when they're issuing new loans, they're actually at a lower rate, the new house loans, than the existing mortgage holders.
Alaska Corla, first of all, I want to thank Deputy O'Keefe for welcoming the publication of the Personal Insolvency Bill yesterday. I think it's a pity that he perhaps took a bit of the good out of the welcome by some of the grudging comments in respect of it. I think it's fair to say, Alaska Corla, that the period of this recession, probably the biggest worry that individuals and families have had, even bigger than the loss of the job or the loss of the business, is the fear of losing their home. People who have found themselves in mortgage difficulties and people who have found themselves in situations of personal debt of one kind or another. And this issue has been addressed by the government in the publication of the personal insolvency legislation yesterday, the most radical reform of personal insolvency legislation that we have seen. And I'd remind Deputy O'Keefe that he had 14 years in government in which to address this issue and didn't. The government has addressed the issue of personal insolvency, introduced legislation which will bring down the period of time to 3 years. That alone will strengthen the hand of borrowers in their discussions with their banks. And then the legislation provides for a range of non-judicial debt settlement arrangements, provision for debt relief certificate in the cases of people who have unsecured debt of under 20,000 or where there's no income and no assets, arrangements for debt settlement arrangements where people again can make a settlement with their bank, and critically the introduction of the personal insolvency arrangement which includes secured debt and will include in that mortgage debt. So for the first time we will now have legislation that will enable borrowers to negotiate debt settlement arrangements on a realistic and reasonable way with their banks and with their financial institutions. And I think it's a good day for this country that for the first time that we now have hope for families and hope for households, that they can see a way of, first of all, them working themselves out of their personal debt situations, and interestingly enough, coming on a day also when as a country we have seen the first signs of hope in relation to our re-entry to the markets, with what we saw yesterday with the bond exchange. First time that the country is back in the market since the September of 2010. So I think that this is a very positive development. The legislation, the intention is that the heads of the bill will go to the Joint Oireachtas Committee, will be discussed there, and obviously any improvements that members of the House or detail that they want to discuss can be discussed there, and then will be formally published and hopefully enacted in a relatively short period of time.
Supplementary question from Deputy O'Keefe. 1 minute.
Yeah, I have to say that Taoiseach is a radically changed man in the last year and a half, because basically what happened yesterday was that the ECB lent money to the banks at 1.5%, who have lent it on to Ireland at 5%, making a very substantial gain because of the arrangement of the ECB. And I have to say that I do compliment the NTMA in availing of the opportunity, but the basic structure is wrong, that the big gains here are the private banks, but that's another day's work.
Question, please.
Now, just to go back to the issue, we do welcome the bill. And I think one of the things that you spoke about before you came into government is about interacting with the House and taking on board suggestions, no matter where they come from, if they're good suggestions. Now, basically what you're proposing in your bill is that the banks, in relation to the biggest loan that most people have, i.e. the secured loan, the mortgage on their house, aren't mandatorily forced to get involved in the debt resolution, and that it's an option for them. And as we know in the past, when the banks have options, they don't always take those options in the interest of the customer. And what we're saying is that it should be mandatory, as it is for the unsecured creditors, to get involved. And that's what we're saying, and that's the fundamental change that we need to make this bill effective. If we don't have that, you have a bill that won't work. And Minister Michael Noonan said yesterday that he was hoping for the cooperation of the banks. Now we know, and you were very critical of the lack of cooperation from the banks right throughout this fiscal crisis, and the fact that, for example, they wouldn't tell us how badly they were scored.
Deputy, this is a supplementary question. Deputy,
I have a question. Now depending on the voluntary goodwill of the banks, I have to say I would have thought above all people that you would have realised that that is a very, very foolish way to go. So my straight question to you is, will you amend the bill to make it mandatory for the banks to engage? And can I finally say, in relation to the bankruptcy issue that you raised, debt resolution should ensure that for the vast majority of ordinary citizens, that bankruptcy will not be the option, and debt resolution will be the option. And bankruptcy is the last thing. And bankruptcy.
Deputy, please.
Can I finish?
I'll have to ask Taoiseach.
Yeah. Bankruptcy is the last.
Deputy, please. Come on, Deputy. Please, I have to call on the Taoiseach now, Deputy, please.
Steady.
Please.
Steady now.
Please. Deputy, will you please have the last question?
It's the last place, as you know, that ordinary people dream of going. They want a resolution to their issues. They don't want bankruptcy.
Thank you, Deputy.
And therefore, I'm asking you to deal with this issue.
Order, sorry, order for the Taoiseach. Please.
Well,
Taoiseach.
first of all, the government will, of course, and is always open to taking on board constructive suggestions from any member of the House in relation to the legislation. And that is why we have decided that the heads of this bill will go immediately to the Joint Oireachtas Committee. We don't intend that that will be a very prolonged period of time. We're looking at perhaps having that process completed by the end of February and then moving ahead with the formal publication of the legislation thereafter. Deputy O'Keefe refers to radical change. This is radical change. There is no other that I'm aware of, no other legislative arrangement of this kind Certainly there has been none in this country to date, nor is there any anywhere else that I'm aware of, which deals with the issue of secured debt in the way that is proposed to be dealt with in this legislation. This isn't some kind of a voluntary, optional arrangement for banks. This is legislation. This is being written into law, a range of non-judicial debt settlement arrangements for the first time, which will give some reasonable prospect that people who have accumulated debts, who find themselves with mortgage debt that they can't pay, some cases people who are facing the awful prospect that they might at some stage lose their home, people who find themselves in negative equity, for the first time, for the very first time, now see a prospect and a way of navigating and negotiating their way out of that. And the banks themselves will know that, as a backstop, that the new, completely changed personal insolvency arrangement, the reduction to 3 years, is in place. So this is quite radical legislation. It's new. It is providing a new basis on which people can work their way out of their personal debts, including mortgage debt, and it is for the first time. We've had a long period of time now since this country went into recession, and people have been looking at all kinds of difficulties, both in relation to their jobs, the economy, the country and their own personal situation. For the first time since this country went into recession, individual families and individual households can look with some hope of getting out of the debt that they're saddled with at present, a legislative basis on which they can get debt resolution, and a new reformed legislative basis for personal insolvency. And I'm glad, in fact, in fairness to the Deputy, that he has, in fact, welcomed the publication of that legislation.
Next question is from